Welcome everyone to episode 6 of the Brick by Brick series by DSG Consumer Partners, where we talk with some of the brightest minds building insurgent brands. For those of you who don't know DSG Consumer Partners, we're an early stage consumer-focused venture capital fund. We invest across India and Southeast Asia. So far, we manage more than $275 million and have invested in more than 75 insurgent consumer brands straddling both consumer products as well as services since 2012. My name is Samir Mehta and I run our Southeast Asia efforts. And today I'm delighted to welcome Vikram Rupani, a co-founder of RedMart and now co-founder of Nuguru. We will talk about culture, scaling winning teams, hiring, and much, much more. We have a great audience today spanning early stage founders from India and Southeast Asia, and members of the DSG ecosystem, members of the consumer ecosystem, and just people interested in culture and scaling. And throughout the session, if you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A tab. I will do my best to integrate as many of them as possible during our dialogue, and the DSG team will help me with that. We have allocated some time at the back end to take those questions. By way of introduction, Vikram co-founded RedMart immediately after graduating from INSEAD with his MBA. This was in 2011. He, along with his co-founder Roger, also an INSEAD alum, grew RedMart from 2 guys in a van into an organization with more than 2,000 people over 5 years, eventually exiting to Alibaba. Every Red Martian that I've ever met swears by their time at RedMart, how enriching it was. And most of the time they say that they've rarely found an organization quite like RedMart. Today, many of these folks are either joining Vikram at Nuguru or are waiting for Nuguru to scale so that they can join Nuguru. Anyhow, let's dig in. Thanks a lot, Vikram, for joining us. I hope you will be candid and you will share your thoughts today. But let's start with the origin story, right? How did you and Roger start? And how did you split your responsibilities and why? I think this is very salient for co-founding relationships. And we have a bunch of co-founders in our fund, in our portfolio. We have a number of solo founders, and we always get this question, right? How do you manage it when you are 2 at the start?
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me, Samir. Look forward to the discussion. So Roger and I actually, as you mentioned, met at INSEAD. We were part of the same cohort in 2010. And in fact, our wives introduced us. It was a bit of a double date. They had met previously and thought we would get along, and they organized a dinner and we hit it off right from the get-go. So I think we were good friends first, but very quickly found that we had complementary skill sets, and also more importantly, were keen to use the INSEAD time to think about things we could do after the program, something entrepreneurial, and start something of our own. In fact, actually, at INSEAD, you've been there, and in one of our entrepreneurship classes, we had done some of those, personality tests and found that we were kind of polar opposites, right? And oftentimes people think that, oh, is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's a very good thing, right? Because you can kind of complement each other's strengths and weaknesses and areas for improvement. And we knew right from the get-go that we would make a strong team. And we started working on INSEAD, on RedMart pretty early in the school year. So it started in Jan, and in Feb, we started working on the idea. And we didn't really discuss, obviously, roles or titles or what we would be doing. We were still trying to flesh out the idea and see whether we would go for it. But then over that 10-month period, we got a lot of conviction. And then when we graduated in December, in March of 2011, we formed the company. And then shortly thereafter, we started talking about kind of, roles and positions. And it was natural, right? Once you start a company and you update your LinkedIn profile, you got to put something over there. So I think the roles assigned came about quite naturally. Roger was very good at thinking strategically, big picture. He had also in his previous life raised a fair amount of capital in an insurance tech startup that he was working on with his dad. So I wouldn't say he enjoyed the fundraising role, but he was actually very good at it. And in terms of building teams, he grew up in a household. His dad used to be the CEO of one of the Fortune 500 companies, Marsh & McLennan. So he grew up in a household seeing what it takes to be a CEO. And, ultimately, if you think of the role of a CEO, it's sort of building the best team possible, giving them the right culture and environment to do the best work, raising capital and setting the strategy for the business. So I think he fit the bill well. On my side, I've always been very detail oriented, enjoyed solving very complex problems. And one could arguably say online grocery is one of the most complicated problems I had to solve, especially if you throw in fresh and frozen and, the last mile delivery and logistics around that. So for me, I kind of relished the opportunity to solve that problem. And also I was very comfortable with numbers. I had an investment banking background, did finance in my undergrad at Babson. So it was kind of natural for me to take the sort of COO, CFO role to start. And this also kind of evolved over the period of time. We can talk about as sort of senior hires came in. But I think the key takeaway there is we really ran the business like a true partnership, and very early on, found we had, I won't lie, there was friction in the beginning. Once you start work, you're out of the MBA honeymoon, and you have investors and you're trying to build the business. So I won't lie, there wasn't friction, but we very quickly learned, to put our egos aside and realize that, any sort of solution that we came up with together was much better than what, any of us could come up with individually. And it was funny, like oftentimes we would have situations where he would start arguing one position, I would start another, and at the end of an hour or two, I would be arguing the position he started with, and vice versa, right? So I think we realized very quickly, given that complementary skill set, that we were able to sort of problem solve much better. In fact, our wives used to joke that, we had a more functional relationship with each other than we had with each of them respectively. So I think it worked out pretty well, but that's kind of how it all began. And, from there on, it grew quite fast.
Yeah, so let's talk about this. That's, I think for the audience, some key words to remember: complementary skill sets, respect for differences of opinion, and yet an ability to negotiate them and come to a consolidated outlook. I always like to use the word with our founders: disagree but commit, right? You can disagree all you want. In the end, once we decide, then we have to commit. And then we can't be second guessing each other along the way. When do you start bringing in senior talent, right? Like, this is something that we have a number of, I'm on the board of a number of companies at DSG. We have great, talented entrepreneurs, phenomenal product guys, marketing guys, but they know they need to bring in talent. And yet, how do you go about doing that, convincing the talent, but also convincing yourselves that you deserve to go find this talent? How did you guys think about that? And what are some of the lessons learned that you'd like to share with members of our audience on that front?
Yeah, sure. So, groceries, obviously being very capital intensive and it's a venture scale business, right? You had to kind of go big or go home. There was no way that you could kind of do it on a small scale, take your time. You needed massive scale to make the economics work. And we knew that from the beginning, right? So, keeping that in mind, we knew that to capitalize on that opportunity and reach that scale as fast as possible, yes, we could certainly try and learn all the different parts of a complex business ourselves, bring in management that perhaps would take time to scale up, but we just didn't feel we had the time. We would definitely run out of cash, if we weren't able to keep up. It was more than a demand problem, it was a supply problem, right? So being able to put in place the talent to unlock that supply chain, unlock those opportunities, and really be able to cater to the demand, which we knew that product market fit existed, right? So I think just as a philosophy, we were always hiring, and as early as possible, I think the biggest thing that we were not afraid of was aiming really high. And I think that oftentimes founders feel like, okay, perhaps now is not the right time. It's too early to get into big guns, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, there is obviously the balance between, managing your cash burn and also finding, having the opportunities, as you said in the introduction, when you have heavy hitters, having the opportunities to really leverage their skill set, right? So I would say, first of all, we were always hiring, and as early as possible, we were looking to bring on senior talent. The other thing I would call out is, oftentimes founders who have started and are very passionate about their company, remember we were working on it the whole 1 year at INSEAD. We had done a lot of research. We had learned a ton about the market, etc. You often find that actually when you go talk to experienced folks who are stuck in the corporate world, their eyes light up, right? They're like, wow, this is amazing. And I know how to solve this problem. And if I had a blank sheet of paper, this is how I would do it, etc., etc. So I think it goes hand in hand with the point of aiming high. There are a lot of experienced people and senior talent who can save you a lot of mistakes if you get them on early enough. And oftentimes they're very inspired. They kind of want to live vicariously through you. They perhaps missed the boat the first time around, and then they have the opportunity and they say, why not? If I can join this team, I would love to get on that rocket ship. The other thing I would say is, when we finally identified if we needed a role, we were very specific of what we needed. I've seen many times where, oftentimes with JD, first of all, sometimes where founders don't even have JDs and they haven't really thought through the job descriptions of what they're looking for. If they have thought about it, then it's like cut, copy, paste from several different JDs that they found on LinkedIn. You find that it doesn't really sync up, what they're looking for from a title perspective versus an experience perspective versus what the role actually requires of the person. Just there's no sort of congruence at all, right? So I think that's another big thing of having clarity. So when you are clear about you need to go after a role, what is that role specifically, and really making sure that you align it for that talent that's really out there, right? And aim high with it. And for the right person, like I mentioned earlier, we always found that they were mostly inspired by building from the ground up, right? And almost that's a bit of a filtering criteria as well. If someone comes and says, I want a nice big pay package and benefits package and health insurance and life insurance, I'm not saying that you shouldn't have these things in due course, but very early on that perhaps they won't be able to make it in a resource constrained environment. One kind of example, to the point of always be hiring. One of our most senior hires right in the beginning was a gentleman who previously worked at Webvan, which was, one of the very early day online grocers, which ultimately blew up, but actually was kind of a front runner in the space, right? And American guy who happened to be in Singapore. And the way we actually found him was, in the early days, we would do the deliveries ourselves. And we had gone up to his house to do a delivery and we didn't know who he was. And he just started picking our brains. We kind of forgot about the rest of the drops. We stopped there for like half an hour and gave him the full pitch. It's a $1 billion market, $8 billion market. We can capture 15%, blah, 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 blah. And like literally we were just pitching to him and we had no idea he was just a customer. And in the next week, we got a LinkedIn message from him saying, hey guys, I'm the guy you delivered to last week. Just so you know, I previously ran operations at Webvan. I'm just in town, not looking, I'm here for I'm married to a Singaporean. I'm really not looking for a job. But if you have work for us, for me, I would love to swing by and check out your operation. And Roger and I were like, this is like unbelievable, right? So kind of like always aiming high. And in that case, we weren't necessarily hiring for that role, but opportunistically, we couldn't let go of that opportunity, right? Like to have someone like that knock on your door, it was something that you should capitalize on. And it helped us tremendously, right? So I think sort of as first-time founders, you often hold on to responsibilities sort of longer than you should, and I think finding the right candidate who can at least scale for the next 36 months, 48 months is going to take time, right? So starting early and making sure that you kind of are always out there, radar on, pitching your business. You never know sort of what connections happen.
I think that's the interesting part here for me. Like, a lot of things here are very salient. But I think the interesting part of always be pitching your business or always be thinking through your idea, getting people to weigh in on it. If not now, it might happen later, right? And very rarely have I seen senior people leave based on one conversation. I mean, it happens, but it's very rare. It's more sustained effort. They've seen you, they've tracked you, and then they will reach out. No, that's very interesting.
And I think the other point there is also the reason why it's important to hire at the right level is ideally you want to build top down to the extent that you can. So whoever's going to be running a department, at least in the intermediate term, builds their own team. Right? The last thing you want is you hire a junior person and then, and perhaps, especially if you don't know that domain, you're probably going to make mistakes. And that junior person who's in the space is perhaps not going to have the best experience reporting to you because you also have no clue about what's going on, right? You're trying to fight fires all over the place. So it's easier if you hire that sort of more senior person. And I'm not saying that this has to be the guy who, the person, who will ultimately take your business public or help you exit and so on and so forth. That's not the case, right? But think that in the beginning, if you can go in at a sort of fairly mid to high level and allow that person to then build down, but also very strategically leave room at the top. So let's say when you think about titling and so on and so forth, that perhaps you have a structure where there's a VP, director, senior manager, etc. Let's say you get someone at a director level, you can still slot in a VP of 3 years from now if you feel like this person is not scaling. Hopefully they can, but not everyone can scale depending on how fast the organization is going, right? So I think when you talk about senior talent, of course, there's different levels of seniority, but I think, kind of throwing the dart at the right place and making sure you get in at the right level is super critical in the early years.
Excellent. I want to switch gears a little bit to
go through, but
right?
Yeah.
So 2,000 people in 5 years, which I didn't know this. You shared this with me while we were preparing for this call, and I knew it was big. I didn't realize there was that many people in 5 years. So give us a sense of the recruiting engine, right? I mean, you hear these stories about, Elon Musk is very famous for this, right? That he's interviewed the first 500 people at Tesla and so on and so forth, right? Which may or may not be true. I have no view on it. But you hear this consistently, right? That the founders want to interview as many people and be responsible for selecting as many people in the early days as possible. But the reality is ultimately you have to build a system, a framework, a process, whatever words you want to ascribe to it. So give us a sense of what RedMart did well to be able to hire so many people at the right quality, train them, retain them, incentivize them. How did that all come together?
Yeah, it's a good point. And maybe just to clarify, so it was 2,000 people. It was about, I would say 1,500 or so of a kind of blue collar workforce, which was across warehouse and last mile operations, so fulfillment and last mile. And there was 400 to 500 people, out of which 100 or so, 120 or so sat in the Bangalore office for engineering and some other functions. We had sort of master data and so on. And then the rest sat in the kind of office here in Singapore. So I guess, it was big numbers by any standards anyway. So getting that engine right, I think correctly, as you pointed out, in the beginning, founders can be part of every interview, and you obviously want to be part of every interview because you feel like you understand exactly kind of what sort of people and sort of culture also you want to bring on board. But naturally, this doesn't scale, right? Beyond a certain point, and especially if you're growing as fast as we were, it's impossible to be there for every single round of interviews and decision making around people, right? So I think scaling sort of the white collar workforce is perhaps a little bit more nuanced, but I'll kind of share process, and then we can circle back to kind of some of the call outs that were different in blue collar, because the volume of hiring is much more, right? And actually turnover, unfortunately, is higher in the blue collar workforce, right? So I think the first step to scaling recruiting is ensuring that the framework for hiring allows you to leverage the entire organization or whichever part of the organization is involved in the recruiting process, and trying to, make that pool as big as possible. And if you do that, you have to ensure that everyone who's then part of that recruiting pool on the company side is good at screening and really understands what they're looking for, right? The step one is basically starting with your company values and your guiding principles and leadership principles, right? What do you stand for? It's important to have these codified, because when you're trying to build a recruiting framework, basically what you're testing beyond the technical side of things is really that cultural fit, right? Because if you scale too fast and you don't keep an eye on that, the culture just gets diluted, and it's very hard to then pull back from that, right? So kind of that's the step one. The second step of that is then identifying, this, depending on the role, there's obviously a hiring manager that's in charge of that role, that role will most likely be reporting into, who decides what of these values or leadership guiding principles do we really want to test that are very important for this role. So take an example, right? If you're hiring head of customer service, you want to make sure that customer centricity is a value that they really live by, right? And have demonstrated that they are able to kind of build a customer-centric team, organization, and so on and so forth, right? I think the other point is, it's if you don't break up the interview process and have a clear framework for what you're testing for, I'm sure all of us have been in this situation when you were recruiting for roles. You come in and the person sits you down and says, tell me about your background. They have your CV in front of you. You can read my CV. Like, why are you asking me about my background, right? Just go and look at it. It doesn't tell you very much, right? So being very thoughtful about how that hiring manager and that whole hiring team, it's multiple people involved, are testing for certain things that are very critical for that role to be, for that person in that role to be successful, right? And those things that you're testing for are essentially a subset of your values as an organization and your leadership and guiding principles of how you want people to effectively behave in your organization, right? So then when you move from there, it's also important, because you'll have multiple candidates. It's also important to make sure that you have consistency, because as you go through multiple candidates, you want to be asking the same questions, or the same people. At least the first question, the leading question, is the same question, right? Follow-on questions and so on can be different, but you want to make sure that at the end of the process, when everyone ultimately comes together, you are able to compare apples to apples, right? A candidate A had a much more nuanced answer to question A than candidate B did, and so on and so forth, right? So let's say we start on the example of customer centricity, right? How do you really judge that in an interview, right? You have a CV, and this is also very, tactical, but I think it's important because a lot of founders don't understand it. They get in an interview, and again, it goes back to give me background. What did you do here? What did you do there? But getting very specific and saying, okay, let's say customer centricity, what have you done in the past that has exceeded an internal or external customer needs? Or let's say you got negative feedback from a customer. What did you do with it, right? So more behavioral sort of questions that really help you to understand thought process, ability to make a change, ability to identify a problem, and so on and so forth, right? So you have that whole hiring process. Again, if it's codified like this, whether the founder or the senior leadership team is in the room or not, it is likely that you'll have a much more unbiased view on filtering the right candidate than if it was just a very generic go in and kind of shoot the shit with the person for an hour and come out, right? So it's very specific in terms of the process of doing it, right? And then ultimately, once you've gone through that whole process, within a short period of time, this was really important. We almost had a penalty for people who didn't kind of report back written feedback within 24 hours, because often you forget, especially when you're meeting multiple candidates in the same day, you mix up, this person said this person said that. And then basically the hiring manager, makes the ultimate decision after hearing everyone's feedback, but you try not to bias people, right? Because if you send the feedback in advance before everyone gathers in a room, then they might change their initial opinions on what that person was, right? So that's kind of a very nuanced process, but it works great, right? And in fact, if you do it well, it just starts becoming part of the regular recruiting cadence. And what you'll end up finding is that as a founder, you can be entirely certain. Of course, people do slip through, but 99% of the time that you would perhaps your team or your extended team would be able to find the same or better candidate than you as a founder perhaps would have thought that you would have found in the first place, right? So it really works well. And ultimately, that's what you want, right? You want to have a consistent process that fits for the best. And the second thing is you want to ensure that you remove that dependency on a few key individuals, right? Because what happens if those individuals leave and all that knowledge of what is good versus what is not,
it's the idea of institutionalized knowledge versus individual knowledge, right?
Absolutely.
And doing that, of course, it's a lot of science, some art as well. Talk me through, we see this a lot with a lot of early stage founders, right? They'll agonize over senior hires and even mid-level hires, because when you have 3 people or 5 people in an organization and you're adding 2 more, those 2 will really influence outcomes, culture, right? And once you get bigger, the game changes a little bit. But you have the system, you have your process, you have the discipline, you're trying to remove bias as much as possible. Increasingly nowadays, you can also use third-party assessments, psychometric tools. Lots of things can be done, right? Because the cost of hiring mistakes is high. But nonetheless, hiring mistakes happen. All of us have been there. How did you approach then? Okay, we made a mistake, and it's not necessarily about the individual. It's just that they're not going to succeed in this role. We can tell 1 month in, 2 months in, 3 months in. What was the rope you gave people to catch up versus saying, you know what, if we don't think this is working, let us help you find something you'll be more successful at? How do you find that right balance? Or did you even think about it as being balanced?
Yeah, I think we made a lot of mistakes where if people were not necessarily suited for the role, and we found out after the fact, and we had already onboarded them and perhaps that kept them along for too long, or perhaps didn't provide the feedback fast enough. And that is really can be extremely detrimental to not just that relationship with that one employee, but also to the whole team, right? Because your A players around you will feel like, hey, this person is not necessarily, carrying their own weight, or perhaps is not, why are you giving them a second chance, third chance, fourth chance? Like, what's going on here, right? So I think talent can very easily kind of see through that. But I think it's important to set people up for success. And, I think we were really big on feedback on very fast iteration cycles. So we never waited for annual feedback or even semi-annual feedback. There's a great book, and I use this now as well, Radical Candor by Scott, where you care deeply about the person, but you directly challenge them. And I think we were very big on, if someone was in a role that we had just hired and we found that they were not kind of landing properly, giving them that feedback quickly and setting the expectation that look, here are the areas where we feel that there are gaps. And I think it also comes back to, again, writing a very strong JD and having a tight hiring process. Because sometimes if you just leave that open, you land a candidate that you think is good, but in your mind, they're expected to do something very different to what that candidate's skill set is, right? So the onus also goes back onto the hiring manager to have done a good job there. But let's say all of that was fine and the person came through, having that feedback loop. And then ultimately, depending on the role, maybe it takes 3 months or 6 months or whatever it is, but having a way out. And in fact, you're almost, I think the way we looked at it was you're almost doing that person a favor, right? Of course, you have to do it respectfully. And, if there's a role in the organization that might be a better fit, perhaps that's an option. But if not, you have to have that difficult conversation, and almost you're setting them like in some sense, if they're not set up for success and you're going to just keep them wilting away in that role, you're not doing them any favors, right? So it's important to kind of pull the trigger sooner rather than later, but after having given the person a fair chance, to understand where the gaps are and fulfill those gaps.
Yeah, so we're touching upon tangentially perhaps aspects of what I would call loosely culture, and what is the culture that we want to build. So talk us through a little bit about, because you and I have talked separately about this, and I know you think a lot about this and at a very deep level. When did you start thinking about codifying culture? When did it become obvious to people this is what it means to be part of RedMart or work at RedMart, right? Yeah. And what advice would you have for founders who are thinking through that, when often culture feels a bit loosey-goosey, right? It's hard to pin down what does it really mean? You know it when you know it, but you can't really describe it, right? But how did you guys go about doing it? I think this will hold people in good stead because, in my experience anyway, this is something that people wait far too long to put active thought towards, and then you end up having accidental cultures, much of which may not be what you desire it to be because you never actively shepherded it anywhere.
Yeah, it happens. It definitely happens like that. And if you're not kind of prescriptive about what sort of culture you want to build, you'll probably end up with the culture you didn't want to build in the first place. So I think you have to be careful about it. But I guess, I agree. A lot of people think it's fluff, but I think it's probably one of the things we did really well at was really focusing on the right time. So maybe just taking a step back, like what is it, right? It's a sort of shared set of values, beliefs, ways of working. It's effectively sort of the operating system for how you expect people to run, work in your organization, right? And I guess then the question is, well, why is it so important to, and I referred to some of this earlier, why is it so important to kind of set it up? I would say that, first of all, it helps you determine, who you want to hire and how you're able to also retain them, right? So if you do it well, you will filter for the right sort of people that meet those sort of same cultural criteria or those values that you want to live by, right? The second point is it also helps sort of create an environment where people can do their best work, whether it's individually, whether it's as a team, because it's setting guiding principles of ways of working, right, in many ways, right? So I think it sets the framework for how we make decisions, how we prioritize things as an organization. So that leads to a lot more harmony in terms of when you're going through discussions around, should we do A or B, or is this more important or that more important? You can always go back to these guiding principles. Let's see, how do these decisions align with these guiding principles, right? So what it ends up doing is building a very sort of harmonious work environment. And finally, it plays a big part in also deciding how people not only get hired, but also how people get rewarded and retained in the organization, right? And then how they progress professionally, right? So it's really critical to get this right. I would say that what is the right time to start codifying it? I would say you can't do it on day one, right? Because you have two founders in a room or a single founder in a room. While you have your own values and ways of working, you definitely need some level of diversity of opinion and some critical mass and have some operating history to say, hey, these are behaviors that we sort of resonate with, right? But I would say the most critical point is before you start ramping up hiring, because it actually lays the foundation for everything we talked about before this in terms of what is your hiring framework to scale. And we said earlier that when you put in place this framework, you have a hiring manager who decides what values you want to test that role against, or what guiding principles and leadership principles you want to test that role against. Well, if you haven't done that work of codifying your values in the first place, how do you know what you're testing against, right? Then it becomes very arbitrary, and it's kind of really depends on the hiring manager, right? So that's a big problem. So I would say the point you put it in is, when you think that you have that critical mass in the room to have a good discussion, and that doesn't mean all senior leaders, because you're not going to have the senior leaders. It means people in different levels of the organization that are very intimately, believe in the vision, the mission, what you stand for, right? And they're already operating in a certain way, but no one has really put that down on paper and said, this is what we stand for, right? But it has to happen before you start hiring rapidly, because if you don't have that framework, it's just going to lead to a mess when you hire, and then unwinding some of those hires is going to be very difficult, right? So then the question, and then to your point, it'll naturally, based on these behaviors, kind of form itself, right? So if you're not prescriptive about sort of the behaviors you want, it's going to be very hard to recover from, because there might be behaviors that creep in with new hires that you perhaps don't align with your organization values, or you as a founder and your values, and so on and so forth, right? So the next question becomes, well, so ours was like in RedMart was about 10 months in, perhaps, after we started the business. So less than a year. In the case of New Guru now, we in fact recently did this, and we're about a year and a half in, let's say. But the team, we took some time to figure out exactly our exact model and get that critical mass on the team. We did it only about a month ago, and it's a long process, right? You start, you sleep over what you come up with. It takes a couple of months to get it right. So how do you really do it, right? I think the first thing is really with that group of people, really identifying what your own values are as individuals first, because ultimately the values that you build for the organization are a collection of the values that you hold near and dear, right? It has to be aligned to the values of the core people that start the founding team, you may call it, the first 10, 15 people, right? Because they've joined for a certain reason. They've been filtered by the founders to come and join that team on that mission for a certain reason. And if you dig deep, there'll probably be some level of alignment across the board between that group on what values they hold dear, right, to themselves. And when you have clarity around what those values are, then you can start deciding, well, how does that extend to the company? If we were to take ourselves out of this and say, okay, this is what we hold dear, what sort of company do we really want to build, and what values does that company need to have, right? So that's how you kind of move from individual to then organization and institutionalize it a little bit, right? Then you move into saying, okay, well, if these are the core values that we had, like we're customers first, we never give up, we do more with less, so on and so forth, right? You have a bunch of values. Then you say, well, how do we really make these into kind of leadership behaviors, and how do we make them actionable, right? So when someone is making a decision, how do we ensure that they have a clear guiding principle to make sure they act in a certain way to achieve that value, right? One example may be, progress over perfection. We believe that we should always move forward no matter what, or perhaps we always make decisions with data, right? We don't make just random gut decisions, or the hippo in the room or the most senior person says, oh, this is what I believe, and we go ahead that way. No matter what, if you have the data, that's a guiding principle, right? So I think you have to kind of move that value to the guiding principle piece. And then from there, you then build it into your frameworks, right? Like I mentioned, recruiting and so on and so forth. So I guess on our side, like I mentioned, we started doing it within 12 months. And over time, I guess the way you really, I talked about the blue collar piece as well. What ends up happening is when you have 1,500 people in the shop floor, you start wondering like, okay, how are they going to interpret this, right? And we had a debate. We said, okay, do our values really need to be the same across these two workforces? Because, your picker or packer perhaps, may not be able to interpret this. But actually the value stays the same, but the lens with which they look at it is a little bit different, right? So when you say do more with less as a value, at the office level, it may be, let's try and be efficient with whatever resources we have, be it even on some simple things like travel and expense. In the warehouse, it could be like, hey, perhaps we could find ways to automate or simplify a process that allows us to improve productivity without adding another headcount. And so really making sure that you provide the lens for everyone in the organization to then interpret those values becomes very important. Otherwise, some people get it, some people don't. So you establish it at the leadership level, but then make sure you give people the lens to actually start interpreting it. The other thing is kind of be loud and be proud about it, right? So once you've really established them, really shout about it, right? And I'm not saying just internally, it's externally as well, because it becomes almost your employee value proposition. What kind of an organization do we really want to be? What kind of people do we really want to attract? Because if they don't have congruence with their own values, with what you've put out there, then there will be a problem later down the line, right? You want to attract people who align with those values, right? And this is not just for employees, it's even other stakeholders like, for example, your vendors and suppliers. When they see that you're operating in a certain way, they start realizing, okay, RedMart is known for this, or New Guru is known for this, and so on and so forth. They get a lot of confidence in working with you as an organization because every interface that they have, whichever team it may be with, there is some kind of similarity in how people operate. It becomes a very cohesive organization to scale. And always, like as leaders, over-communicate, right? When you're making a decision, always try and tie it back, right? Why am I making this decision, right? Why am I going to do A versus B? And how does that relate to the values that we stand for as an organization, right? So always over communicate till, like, to you, it may sound like I'm just being repetitive, like a broken record. But actually, when you have a 2,000 person organization, the person in the warehouse is just not hearing it, right? Till you say it 10 times over, right? So it almost becomes ingrained. The other big tip that I would say, and, one of the key learnings we had, the best time to almost inculture people is when they come on board first, right? So either Roger or myself, we had like an employee onboarding orientation, every week or 2 weeks. Let's say we did it twice a month. One of us would go there and go through this culture deck with them and give them examples and stories of, hey, what does this value mean? Let me tell you, when we started, this is how we lived it, and this is why it's important, and so on and so forth, right? When people are just joining, they're very open, and they want to learn. They're like sponges absorbing knowledge. They want to do well in their role. It's the best time to plant those seeds in. And then when you do this again and again, and that new recruit starts experiencing the culture around them, it just gets cemented in their mind, right? And that's how you build that culture that becomes lasting throughout the organization. So a lot to kind of digest there, but I think it works. There is a formula to it, and we've seen it work, and we're kind of following that same playbook again with New Guru. But I think once you do it right, it allows you to leverage yourself significantly and then meet those objectives like we talked about in terms of hiring, retaining, rewarding, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, on that subject around scaling and so evolving, right? Talk us through a little bit as, how did you and Roger as individuals scale yourselves, right? So you have roles that started out 2 guys in a van, as you described it, right? And that changes fast. And you said, ultimately the role of founders, CEOs, leadership team is, I boil it down to 3 things, right? Ensure there's enough cash, i.e. resourcing, have clarity on what the strategy is, i.e. vision, mission, values, and how we're going to go do it, and hire the best possible talent you can to get ahead of the curve. And fundamentally, everything boils down to 3. And of course, you can get as detailed as you want underneath those 3 broad topics, but that's what it boils down to, right? So how did you guys evolve? And, what I'm really curious about is you were able to attract some amazing people. And one example is like Colin, who was Jeff Bezos' technical advisor, senior leader at Amazon for more than a decade, now a best-selling author. This is not normal to be able to attract people like that for a young, scrappy company. And I know at that time you were not as young anymore, but nonetheless, in the scheme of the world, RedMart was small for someone of this talent to be attracted to, right? So how did you think about your role evolution as individuals, right? How did you challenge yourself to grow? I saw an interesting question, which I'll try and weave in, about a growth mindset. And what are the trade-offs with having this growth mindset versus the cost it sometimes imposes on people, yourselves as individuals and the people reporting directly to you? So I'll tee that off, and now you get to answer that complicated question.
Yeah, I mean, with Colin, we got extremely lucky, right? So he was spent over a decade at Amazon, and I think the reason why so he was looking to move to Singapore. Actually, they were debating between Barcelona and Singapore, and they wanted to give their kids an international experience. And the way he reached out to us was he asked his network in Seattle or wherever he was at that time, I'm moving to Singapore. Do you know of any good companies? I'm thinking I don't want to just hang out there. I'll get bored. Perhaps I can kind of use this skill set. And 3 or 4 people told him about RedMart. I think there was obviously similarity with Amazon e-commerce. It was still early in the ecosystem days over here. And he reached out to us, and it was actually almost like a 2-for-1 deal. His wife was also coming, right? Obviously, the whole family was coming, and they both were looking for opportunities. And when we got that introduction, and Roger and I went on LinkedIn and checked out his background, we were like, holy, what is going on here? Why does this guy come and work for us? So we had a call with him, and we were just blown away. And we were like, listen, we've, at that time, the company was probably like 100 million top line, but we knew we had a long way to go. Things kept breaking. There was a lot of stress. Things were not scaling, and we knew that opportunity was much bigger, right? So when he said he's interested, and Sarah, his wife, said they're interested, we said, come and take whatever role you want. You want to be CEO, to take a step back. And I think just having that self-awareness that ultimately, once yes, you can try and scale yourself as fast as possible, and you should. But if the business is moving faster than your potential, or people have done it before, why not leverage that? I think this is a big difference between first-time founders and second-time founders. First-time founders are always like, oh, let me figure out how to do it myself. Second-time founders, the first thing they do is, let me figure out who's done this before and who solved this problem before, and pick up the phone and try and connect with them, and learn from them, and perhaps even bring them on board to solve the problem for me, right? And I think that's we noticed at that point that we needed help. And in fact, it worked out really well because when you talk about how the roles evolved, right? At that time, we were we were going deep into fundraising. Like this was Series C. So this is like 2014, 15 timeframe around there. And it was a point where we were raising a fair amount of capital. I think it was a $50 million round or something like that. And that was the time where obviously any investor wanted to see us both there and also see, many members of the leadership team there, especially after the first or second meeting. And we started getting very tied up with that. So we said, oh, this is great. Like if Colin is willing to come, he can become COO. And then we had a debate on, because I was, that was my title at that time. I was like, I don't care. I'll take any title. We spoke to one of our investors. He said, don't do a co-CEO. It doesn't work out for different reasons, et cetera, et cetera. So I just took the role of president. And what we did was, what we were finding before, there was a lot of tension between the functions that reported to Roger and myself because they needed to work very closely together, but they weren't because they were reporting to me and Roger. Then we would discuss if there were any misalignments and then it would go back the other way, right? So it was a very long, drawn out, telephone game where it would have been faster and easier if they all reported into the same function, which ended up being Colin, right? So what I mean is, for example, customer facing, like let's say marketing or even commercial and merchandising previously sat under Roger. Operations, finance, people, logistics, all of that sat underneath me, right? But now when you do a marketing promotion and the warehouse is not aware of it and the marketing goes ahead and does it without informing the warehouse or properly coordinating with the warehouse, it's a disaster. It's a complete disaster. Yeah. So then when Colin came, we restructured the whole thing. And what we did was we took those functions that needed to be more attached to the hip and put them underneath him. And then we started looking outwards, right? So we kept some of the support functions like DevOps, others, CTO and co-founder report, kept point to Roger, but that was more removed from the day-to-day engineering side. And then some support functions, finance and HR report to me, but then Colin took over everything, right? And then we started focusing on spending time on the raising the capital and so on and so forth, which we didn't enjoy, but we had to do, right? It was something that it was just part of the process. And then after we ultimately sold the business, Colin decided to move back to Seattle. He had finished his 2-3 year stint or whatever it was. But we realized that actually the structure that he had put in place and the way we had reorganized made a lot of sense, right? And that we shouldn't kind of break it up again as to how it was prior to that. And obviously with the integration, there was a lot of management internally with Lazada and Alibaba and so on and so forth. So Roger was the lucky one. He got that job to figure it out. I said, you know what, I'll take this umbrella. That's our whole team and I'll run with this, right? So that's kind of how we reorganized and evolved over time. But I think, to your point, it's magical when you find the right people and get them together and you give them that environment and culture to really succeed, because actually your job is to understand the culture and really ensuring that people understand the values of how we want to operate. Beyond that, it's just a little bit of guidance and nurturing and obviously pushing the strategy. But beyond that, I think it was the best time ever after we sold because we never had to worry about capital. And that 2 years, 2017, 18, was we ramped up from like 100 million to 400 million. And it was the best time ever. But it was because of a lot of the work and the infrastructure we had put in place before then.
I want to pick on that a little bit, right? That there was this huge inflection point post-sale, partly because, resourcing from a capital point of view was taken away as a problem statement, right? But talk to me a little bit about, when you have integrations of two potentially very different cultures. I mean, I don't know enough about the Alibaba culture, so I'm in no position to comment. But at a minimum, I would assume it's a bit different, right? Or was a bit different. How did people who grew up in a particular environment, a particular system, adhere to a particular cultural code, if you will, and now you slap people together, what were some of the difficulties that you guys faced as individual leaders as well as team leaders? And then how did you go about negotiating them, right? I think that'll be, again, it's not an experience that a lot of people have, but in a slightly different context, a lot of people have this experience where when there are big teams that get acquired, where there are, different leaders who come in who build their own teams and their own image, and then you start seeing this play out in that type of scenario.
Yeah, so I think that with Lazada, we were kind of a bit of the stepchild because there was Alibaba had acquired Lazada a year before, and then a year later they acquired us. So we were kind of in the mix. Alibaba was still figuring out their own differences. And of course, Lazada came from the rocket background, Alibaba, a very Chinese company. And here we are, which was even a subset of, in terms of Lazada was multi-country. We were here, Singapore only, groceries only. So we kind of had to just go with the tide. And I think the biggest difference for us was Lazada was a market, or still is mostly a marketplace business, right? And we were primarily retail. 80% of that 400 million was retail, right? So we bought, held, and delivered that inventory ourselves. We obviously had a marketplace business, but it was the minority, right? And I think that if you just take those two things, the customer is very different. When you think about the customer in the marketplace ecosystem, it's more biased towards the seller as opposed to the end buyer. Right. Whereas in our case, we were the seller, right? The customer was the B2C end buyer. Yeah. And also as a category, groceries is a lot of, the business is purely built on repeat, right? High retention and repeat, because once you build that trusted relationship of delivering someone food in full, on time, good quality, they just keep coming back. There's no reason for them to stop, which is again very different to if you're selling a one-off item on Lazada. Of course, there's a lot of different one-off items, but different sellers, different categories. It's not building a basket. So I think that fundamental difference in terms of the operation and who the customer was led to a lot of disagreements in terms of how we had to take things forward, integrating the apps, thinking about the consumer experience, but also the logistics and back-end experience. And there was a lot of arguments there. Ultimately, I think, you do the best you can, but as you sell a company, you have to realize that it's no longer your baby, right? And of course, they have a strategy that they want to put forth. But I think once you feel like your values that have been built over those years, you feel like they're being violated, you just got to move on, right? Because there's only so much you can do. And I think kudos to the whole team. Even beyond the founding team and the senior leadership team, people are still there fighting the good fight and, trying to do the best they can to maintain that customer experience. But I think, it has stagnated. I think if you talk to anyone who saw RedMart pre-integration and RedMart post-integration continues to complain. Even my helper at home says, "Oh, this doesn't work and this didn't show up." Stop telling me. I don't want. But I think that was a big challenge. And we learned a lot through that. But ultimately, the business didn't need to be part of a larger entity because, and to your point about that 17-18 period where we took off the capital constraint, this business, if we could plan longer term, which we put in a massive capital infrastructure investment at that time with our West FC new warehouse, then you could really turn up the volume on the demand, right? And it allowed us to do that. So I guess pros and cons, but it was a difficult experience for sure.
I want to encourage people to write in their questions, and we're going to start taking some of the audience questions. So please feel free to ask whatever you want. I'll try and integrate some of the questions. You alluded to this a little bit, right? If you were to do the RedMart journey again, what would you do differently? There's obviously some notes around grocery retail is a vexingly hard business, as you know. It's a 4 to 6% net margin business globally if you're lucky. So really, it's all about scale. Would you choose to embark on that journey again, knowing the margin structure of this trade?
It was I think probably the hardest category you could pick for online. And I think there was we didn't realize it going in. But would I do it again? I think absolutely. I think the learning was phenomenal, and I think the reason we're here today, have been through that journey, was because of the learning that we went through then. I think one of the key things that was also a tipping point and where things changed was, when we were approaching that Series C stage, it was a lot of actually even before when we started the business and we had the thesis, at INSEAD, that it could be $1 billion business in Singapore alone, people thought we were crazy. Right? There's no freaking way you can do that. And we're like, no, the math adds up. It's a 8 billion grocery market, take 10 to 15% online penetration, and you take 60% market share. Numbers add up. It'll work. And it's genuinely on that path, right? It's a $600 million business today, or whatever it is, right? And I would argue that if it had stayed independent and done what it had to do, if it had that capital, it would have hit that number by now anyway. But I think the point that, sort of tipped us off our scales was when we were doing that capital round in 2015, 16, there was a lot of pressure to internationalize, right? People still kept saying, "Oh, you're a single country play. what is this? It's not big enough, etc. And I would argue like we were 3 years, 4 years early. Imagine if we were still in Singapore, focused, doing 800 million plus when COVID came along, right? It would have been a whole different ball game. But unfortunately, during that time, there was a lot of pressure to say, okay, start multi-market. And if you're doing a retail model, the infrastructure that you need to start a second market is no joke, right? And of course, some of it is, the learning is transferable, but you need the hard assets on the ground, which takes time and capital to build, right? I think if we had been more sort of stuck to our guns there and said, no, we're not going to do this, and here's why, and found the right investors. And again, the market situation end of 2015, 2016 was like it how it was. It's been in the last couple of months, right? There was sort of sudden change and sudden shift in sentiment. So I think that was a big one for us where, if we had kind of strategically stuck to our guns and said, no, we can make this thesis play out, and found the right partner at that time who could have supported us, perhaps the outcome would have been different. The other thing I would say is, some of the senior talent, we definitely did the best we can, but there were certain roles where we waited too long, whether it was on, even senior finance leadership, when you're bringing in, you have that kind of capital involved and flows, really having the right controls in place, the right FP&A process, the right business partnering process just gives you a lot more visibility. So it's not that we didn't have it, but I think we could have done a much better job and seen further out than where we were anticipating. And I think a lot of people underestimate the value of that and doing it well. So I think there was probably two things that stand out today, but again, it's been a while now. So I'm sure if I had more time, I could dig something or more out.
I want to integrate two questions that are here around, how do you decide whether someone was a culture fit or not? I mean, we talked about the process. So let's agree that we thought somebody was a fit. They ended up being a misfit. And then what do you do with the fact that you have a misfit, i.e. probably the wrong hire, right? I know you alluded to the fact that you look for internal role, but how fast did you act versus how fast do you think people should act, especially when they're early in their journeys?
I think it depends on the role, right? And the seniority of the role and the complexity around sort of the infrastructure, right? So say, for example, if it's a finance manager role, that's pretty straightforward to tell, right? But if it's a very complex, specific, let's say a role in supply chain management, and the operation in itself takes time to understand, then the timeline is a little bit different, right? So I think it really depends on the role. But I would say, 3 months at most, probably 6 months if it's more complex, and anyone would take time to understand the baseline and the starting point. Perhaps you give them a little bit more time. But I think the other point is you can't, land the person after orientation and 3 months later show up and say, hey, you're not doing a good job. See ya. Like, that's just not fair.
So I mean, I think this, and it's interesting. I like you have lived all over the world, worked all over the world. And I always find it fascinating how hard it is still in Asia, I would say. I'm going to make a general comment, but I think it still holds true to provide direct, actionable feedback without people getting very concerned about people's feelings, right? This seems to be like a real problem, even with a lot of our founders, right? The inability to provide direct feedback that's constructive, that is solution-oriented, but somehow the fear of offending people subsumes all the other higher order objectives, right? And we see a lot of this, but course correction is indeed important.
I would definitely recommend that book. I put in the chat, Radical Candor. I mean, we learned a lot as well on how to do this. Of course, it's a more Western thing than an Asian thing. But I do think, by just letting it simmer, it leads to a bad culture, right? Because I think it's not like people are oblivious to the fact that, it's not working out. So there's always this underlying tension, where perhaps they go home and they complain to their spouses, or, they're not being their best selves or not being as productive, knowing that they're not doing well, right? And I think either you fix that or they find an alternative. And I think you're doing everyone a favor if you do that. So I do agree. I think it's a cultural thing, but given you are building your culture, make it part of your culture early on, make it acceptable. And I think the way you make it acceptable is you as founders should also be good at receiving feedback and also encouraging your teams to give you feedback. Like, especially if you're a first-time founder, you're probably making a ton of mistakes, and don't take it personally, because actually people are making you better by giving you that feedback and you allowing that to happen and not taking it as a sign of, hey, I'm your boss. I mean, that's not the kind of culture you want to build, right? You want to build a culture where people are free, of course, respectfully sharing their opinions. And of course, there's a saying, you always praise in public and give feedback in private, right? Figure out some of these mechanisms and do it often enough. And if you can build that as part of your culture, make it a value. We give people the platform to succeed. That's a guiding principle, right? And do all that we can to make them succeed. And if you make that part of your value and people start practicing it, it'll just become second nature. And over time, people will know that it is expected that you give feedback. And in fact, if you don't, you're violating some of the values of the organization.
Yeah, I'm mindful of time, and I'm sitting between people's dinners and in Singapore and probably people's chai in India. I want to end with, you have this, one of the few second-time founders in our region, I would say, who's seen a whole life cycle from start to exit, are now embarking on Nuguru. So tell us a little bit about what Nuguru is doing, and tell us a little bit about, and I know the answer, so I'm leading you here, but tell us a little bit about what you're doing to help young consumer companies, right? And you and I are involved in one specifically, and we can talk about that. But I think it'll be interesting for people to hear what you're doing now, and what are the various mechanisms that you're using to deploy the learnings that you and the other team members have against new opportunities.
Yeah. So basically, we've set up a holding company where we're both incubating our own brands as well as investing in brands in the clean label, better for you wellness space, mostly focusing on food and bev, but could be some adjacent categories. So, one of the portfolio companies we jointly invested in is Moom, a supplement business by Millie and Maya. And basically, we help these founders and also, founders have started their own businesses, but help them really scale. And I think in the early days, you always have this chicken and the egg problem. You need the right talent, but either you can't afford it or you can't attract it. But actually, you can only do so when you scale, but you need them to scale, right? So given the network that we have and the culture that we had, we have found that there is this talent that exists that would actually be very happy working across multiple businesses, right? And we're leveraging that talent to help some of these founders and businesses, get up the learning curve faster than they would have themselves. And then passing the baton back to them, building their teams, passing the baton back to them to then run it as their own function and so on and so forth, right? So I think we are learning a lot. The model is still evolving. It's been fun so far. We have one incubation and one investment, but we have a lot of interest and the pipeline is building pretty fast. And it's what we love doing, right? Building that 0 to 1 and really kind of helping people avoid some of the mistakes that we made. I think one of the key differences, and I think actually, I wouldn't say difference, what we're leveraging more. So again, with hiring and building teams, I would say when you're recruiting, right, I think this has changed post-COVID. But when you're recruiting, we always had this philosophy at RedMart, like if the context allows and if the situation allows, like try before you buy, right? If there's a way to engage people in a meaningful way beyond an interview, let's say carve out a project that is 1 month or, a couple of weeks, but set them up for success. So it's very defined. You're not expecting the exact answer because, of course, they have limited information and so on and so forth. But let them come in and be part of the organization, see how they interact with multiple stakeholders and so on and so forth, right? If you can do that, you'll get a much better sense of how that person will really be when they do land a position full time. And obviously through COVID, a lot of people have become a lot more flexible. So what we're doing a lot more now is building that team in that format where we have people who aren't necessarily full-time, but we have that network of folks who've actually worked with us. We know exactly how they work, what their strengths are, how they could really plug into some of these organizations, and then leveraging them, on a part-time basis and turning it up and down as the portfolio companies require or as we require, but getting that best talent and that amazing, real senior talent as early as possible. Because like you said, many people struggle with making that decision. So if we can do it in a non-committal way, at least they get to experience the benefits of it without having, dipping their toes in and realizing for themselves what a difference it could make.
Excellent. Thanks, Vikram. I think on that note around what Nuguru is doing and some of the exciting work we're doing together, I want to thank you again for spending time with us.
Yeah, sure. This is great.
Vikram can be found on LinkedIn. You can find DSG obviously on LinkedIn and other platforms that you might use. We look forward to hearing about the consumer stories that people are building. So thanks a lot. Have a great night, everyone.
Awesome. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.